Jon led his modest procession out of King's Landing at a steady pace, the pounding of hooves marking each turn through the winding streets. The city's stench gave way, bit by bit, to the cleaner air of open fields and rolling countryside. The gold cloaks posted at the mighty gates parted to let the party pass. Most wore the new black and red cloaks of Jon's provisional royal guard, though a few still wore the battered gold of the old regime. None dared raise a whisper of complaint, seeing Ghost trotting at the head of the column, his white fur a stark contrast to the dirt road. The direwolf's ears flicked and swiveled at every strange noise. A cart's wheel squeaking, a peasant calling out from a nearby farm, alert and ready. Tyrion rode nearby atop his stocky mount, face shaded by a broad-brimmed hat to ward off the bright morning sun. He was clad in boiled leather and half-plate that gleamed in the golden light, and the look on his face wavered between excitement and disquiet. Sansa was close behind Jon, guiding her dappled mare with careful hands. She looked quieter than usual, but there was a light in her eyes that had been absent all the long weeks of her captivity. Perhaps it was simply relief to be free of King's Landing's oppressive walls. They traveled a league or two before stopping for a brief rest, letting the horses drink from a shallow stream that cut across the road. Small farms dotted the landscape, each with a palisade of rough-hewn logs around a dirt yard. The people stared from a distance, some waving uncertainly at the party of armed men, uncertain whether to hail them or hide. Jon tried to offer a polite nod whenever he caught a villager's eye, hoping to foster some goodwill. He was painfully aware that, to most small folk, the difference between one king and another was meaningless if their fields were trampled by warring armies. They continued south after watering the horses, heading toward the Rose Road. The plan was to veer off toward the Mander once they reached the crossroads near Bitterbridge, where Renly's letter indicated he would ride to meet them. Jon's retinue was small, fewer than 50 mounted men in total, but enough to deter ordinary bandits. Alongside them rode a handful of loyal knights, among them Ser Howard Rivers, the Riverlands knight who'd pledged fealty after Joffrey's overthrow, and Ser Balman Mertens, a minor lord from the Crownlands. Tyrion had personally vetted them for loyalty, though Jon knew loyalty in these times could be fickle. The first night, they made camp in a copse of old oaks just off the main road. The men erected tents around a central fire, and Sansa retired early into the privacy of her tent, one of the few luxuries Jon had allowed. A hush fell as the sky darkened to midnight blue, the distant stars flickering. Tyrion and Jon sat near the fire, sharing a meal of smoked fish and hard bread that tasted better than the fare at King's Landing's feasts, if only for the crisp night air and the faint warmth of a genuine hearth. Ghost lay nearby, nose on his paws, eyes half-lidded but still watchful. Tyrion cut the fish with a small dagger, an absent expression on his face. "It's a fine night," he remarked, after a silence that stretched a bit too long. "A pity I can't appreciate it more. My mind keeps returning to the problems we left behind in the capital." Jon nodded, hugging his cloak around him. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead. "I know the feeling. Every time I think of Tywin's letter, his demands, I can't help but wonder if we should have been more cautious or tried to negotiate differently." "If we had, you'd be dead," Tyrion said bluntly. "I know my father well enough. He sees the world in stark terms. Either Joffrey sits the throne and House Lannister stands supreme, or everything else is an insult to be crushed. And as for your origins, you, a Targaryen with Stark ties, are a living threat to all he's built." Jon stared into the flickering flames. "Yet I'm trying to avoid war. I never wanted the throne. I never wanted to kill Joffrey. Even now, I'm giving him a fair trial. I only wanted to stop the cruelty to protect my family, the realm. Am I foolish to think that might be enough?" Tyrion's laugh was soft but not unkind. "You remind me, strangely, of your father, your alleged father, that is, Rhaegar. They say he was noble, earnest, a dreamer who believed in prophecy and the better angels of humanity. But the world is cruel, and the powerful seldom respond to gentleness with anything but scorn. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try, mind you, but be prepared for betrayal at every turn." Jon closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the swirl of rumor around Rhaegar Targaryen, the ballads that claimed he was a good man who died for a cause. "I'll keep my eyes open," he said quietly. Then he forced himself to set aside the brooding thoughts, turning to more practical matters. "Tomorrow we'll ride hard. Renly said he'd meet us near Bitterbridge in 7 days. Let's hope the roads stay clear." They lapsed into a more comfortable silence, letting the night sounds envelop them. Crickets in the tall grass, wind in the trees. Jon eventually withdrew to his tent, leaving Tyrion sipping from a wineskin and staring at the dancing embers. Ghost followed Jon, padding in close behind. Sansa's tent was only a short distance away. A single guard stood watch near her flap, ensuring no intruders could disturb her. The guard saluted Jon, who nodded in return. Inside his own tent, Jon unbuckled his sword belt and set Longclaw carefully aside. The Valyrian steel glimmered in the lamplight, an heirloom from House Mormont, but now his by right of deed and gift. He ran a hand over the pommel, thinking how the white wolf's head had replaced the old bear. An apt symbol for him once, but what was he now, a wolf or a dragon? He drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by half-dreams of burning castles and swirling snow. When he woke at dawn, he felt less rested than he had before sleeping, but he forced himself to gather his gear. They had miles to cover. They traveled thus for several days, passing farmland and hamlets, crossing small rivers by ancient stone bridges. The Rose Road was wide and well-trodden, though the traffic was sparse compared to peacetime. Now and then, they'd overtake a merchant's cart, or a group of small folk traveling to find refuge deeper in the Reach, worried about wars to come. Rumors flew in both directions. Talk of Tywin gathering an army at Harrenhal, of Stannis mustering ships at Dragonstone, of Greyjoy longships prowling the coasts. Some travelers asked if the rumor was true that Joffrey had been overthrown and that a Targaryen now held King's Landing. Jon's men would simply nod, or wave them on. It was not wise to proclaim too loudly unless they knew their audience well. Sansa grew more confident in the saddle, the color returning to her cheeks with each day away from the Red Keep. She spoke occasionally with Tyrion or Ser Howard Rivers, asking about the local plants and fauna. Sometimes she asked Jon about the north, reminiscing about Winterfell. He answered her with gentle honesty, though each recollection left a pang in his heart. Winterfell felt so distant, nearly a lifetime ago since the day Ned was executed. It was on the 6th day that they found an outpost near the Mander, where a handful of tents bearing Renly's stag sigil combined with the Tyrell Rose had been erected. The bright green banners fluttered in the afternoon sun, and a few knights on horseback rode out to meet Jon's party, lances upright as a sign of peace. Jon signaled his men to halt and rode forward with Tyrion at his side. The lead knight was tall and well-built, with an open face and a cheerful grin. He wore the sigil of House Florence from the Reach, though a golden stag was quartered with the red fox on his surcoat. "Hail, travelers," he called. "Are you the Targaryen king come for parley with his grace King Renly?" Tyrion hid a smile behind his glove. "He is indeed," he said, glancing up at Jon, who sat quietly, scanning their reaction. "We come in peace, invited by your king. May we approach?" The knight bowed in the saddle with a flourish. "Of course. I'm Ser Luther Foxglove, in service to King Renly Baratheon. We've awaited you these past 2 days. I'll escort you to our encampment." Jon nodded. "Lead on." He felt a surge of nerves, but also determination. An alliance with Renly, or at least a truce, might be their best hope against Tywin. Ser Luther and his fellow knights turned their horses and guided Jon's party along a winding track. Before long, they arrived at a larger cluster of tents by the riverbank, a temporary camp established for the parley. Dozens of mounted men bearing the Golden Stag and the Tyrell Rose stood watch, scanning for threats. At the heart of the camp rose a grand pavilion in green and gold, presumably Renly's personal quarters. Nearby, smaller pavilions displayed the sigils of various Reach lords: Oakheart, Rowan, Tarley, and others. The thick smell of horseflesh and cooking fires drifted on the breeze. Jon dismounted, handing the reins to one of his knights, and motioned for Tyrion and Sansa to accompany him. Ghost paced at his side, drawing wary looks from Renly's men, who had clearly never seen a direwolf so large and calm. The tension in the air was palpable. The men recognized that Jon was no ordinary visitor, that the realm's future might hang on these negotiations. Renly himself emerged from the large pavilion, followed by a small retinue. He cut a striking figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a green doublet embroidered with golden stags prancing at the hem. His eyes sparkled with confidence, and a half-smile graced his lips as he surveyed Jon's approach. Beside him stood Margaery Tyrell in a gown of pale green that complemented her softly curled brown hair. Her face was calm, though her brown eyes studied Jon intently, assessing him with keen intelligence. A cluster of powerful lords hovered behind them. Randyll Tarly, Mathis Rowan, and others, each wearing a politely guarded expression. As Jon and his companions drew closer, Renly spread his arms in greeting. "At last, the famed Jon Targaryen," he said, voice light and welcoming. "Or should I say Jon Stark, or Jon Snow? Rumor provides many names. But welcome, truly." Jon inclined his head. "Jon Targaryen will suffice," he said, voice firm. "I thank you for meeting me. I come in the hope that we can find common ground to avoid further bloodshed." Renly stepped forward, clasping Jon's forearm in a gesture that blended respect and mild familiarity. "A worthy goal," he agreed. Then he turned, gesturing to the lady at his side. "This is my queen, Margaery Tyrell. I trust you have heard of her beauty, though rumor can hardly do her justice." Margaery dipped a graceful curtsy. "Welcome, your grace," she said to Jon. "The realm could use peace as much as it needs a strong king. Perhaps you and my husband can find the best path forward." Jon noted the subtle emphasis on "my husband." Rumors had circulated that Renly's true affections lay elsewhere, but Margaery Tyrell was no fool. Her family's alliance with Renly was built on many layers, some rumored, some unspoken. "I'm honored to meet you, my lady," Jon replied politely. "I've heard you are as gracious as you are fair." A flicker of a smile played across her lips. Then Renly's gaze swept past Jon to take in Tyrion and Sansa. He recognized Tyrion at once, though his expression did not reveal any open hostility. "Lord Tyrion Lannister," Renly said, giving a small nod. "I'd not have expected to see you in the company of a Targaryen. Or is this a sign that House Lannister is divided?" Tyrion offered a crooked grin. "House Lannister is indeed complicated these days, your grace. Let's say I prefer to align with those who aim for justice and stability, rather than cruelty and madness." Renly's eyes flicked to Sansa. "And you must be Lady Sansa Stark," he said gently. "I heard you were Joffrey's betrothed, once upon a time. I'm pleased to see you safe and free of his tyranny." Sansa bowed her head, her voice soft. "I owe my freedom to my brother, King Jon," she said, stumbling a little over the formal title but resolute. "I thank you for welcoming us." Renly offered a disarming smile. "No thanks needed. We all have reason to oppose Joffrey's reign." At that, he gestured for them to follow him into the pavilion. Jon turned to his men, instructing them to make camp nearby but remain on alert. Ghost, of course, stuck close at Jon's side, causing a stir among the guards who eyed the White Wolf nervously. Renly's men, after a few wary glances, allowed the dire wolf entry. In truth, Ghost's presence was probably as effective as bringing a dozen swordsmen. Inside the pavilion, the air felt cooler. Rich carpets spread across the grass floor, and a large table stood at the center, set with pitchers of wine and goblets. Renly and Margaery took seats at one end, while Jon, Tyrion, and Sansa settled at the other. A few of Renly's trusted lords, Randyll Tarly among them, hovered close enough to observe, though they left the main seats empty, a sign that this was a more private talk. Renly poured the wine himself, handing goblets around. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his cup in a toast. Jon and the others drank, though cautiously. The wine was sweet, likely from the arbor, a sign of Tyrell wealth. Margaery sipped hers delicately, then set it aside. Renly leaned forward. "Let's speak openly, Jon. You've seized King's Landing from Joffrey, who by all accounts is no rightful king at all, being born of incest. You call yourself Targaryen. You claim your father was Rhaegar, yes? I know the talk, that Ned Stark hid you to protect you from Robert's wrath. And now you hold the throne. That's all well and good. But the realm is fragmented. Stannis claims it by Baratheon blood, Robb Stark has declared himself king in the north, and I have the support of the Reach. If we keep the realm fractured, Tywin Lannister or the Ironborn or some other threat might run rampant. So how do we unite? Jon weighed his words carefully. I'm not here to challenge the Reach or House Tyrell. Indeed, I want your friendship. The truth is, I never sought to be king, but Joffrey's crimes and the revelation of my parentage forced my hand. I have no quarrel with you or your people, if you do not seek to unseat me. Renly's green eyes sparkled with wry amusement. But I too am a king. The lords of the Reach crowned me, and many others joined my cause. Am I to simply bend the knee to a Targaryen? The Baratheons won the throne from the Targaryens in Robert's rebellion. Would it not look unseemly to yield it back so easily? Marjorie's voice interjected quietly. Husband, you might consider that Rhaegar was beloved by many who remember his generosity and vision. A child of his might stir old loyalties. The common folk are rarely consulted in these matters, but if they sense a second dance of the dragons on the horizon, they might flee or revolt. Randyll Tarly, stern-faced and broad-shouldered, spoke up for the first time. Your Grace, with all respect, House Tarly pledged itself to King Renly, but we did so to rid the realm of Joffrey's rule. We believed the boy was no true king. If this Targaryen has indeed ended Joffrey's reign, then perhaps the realm no longer needs two kings. Renly cast Tarly a glance that was not entirely pleased. We cannot dismiss my brother Stannis. He'll never accept a Targaryen on the throne, nor will he accept me. He views the crown as his by right of seniority. Jon agreed, remembering Stannis's curt letter. He's declared war on me as well. If we remain divided, Tywin might exploit that, or Stannis might. The realm bleeds while lords proclaim themselves kings. We need a single seat of power. I prefer that seat be mine. But perhaps there is a way to share power, to unify forces under a single banner, at least until we restore stability. Renly sipped from his goblet, thinking. Share power. A co-regency, is that what you suggest? Or a marriage alliance, tying our houses together so that the realm sees unity between Baratheon and Targaryen? Of course, I am already wed, he added, glancing at Marjorie with a fleeting smile. And I suspect you'd not want to wait for me to become a widower. A faint flicker of discomfort passed over Marjorie's face, though she masked it quickly. We may not speak of such dire outcomes, my lord. There are other ways alliances can be formed. My brother Loras is dear to Renly, but I doubt that helps here. She paused, letting a gentle laugh ripple in the air, though it did not entirely dispel the tension. Perhaps one of my cousins might be of an age to wed King Jon, or there are other ladies in Highgarden's extended family. Such a union could bind the new Targaryen throne to House Tyrell's support. Jon felt a wave of uncertainty. Marriage as a political tool was hardly surprising. Indeed, it was common practice among great houses, but he had never envisioned himself forced into a union for alliances. His mind flicked briefly to the memories of Ygritte, though that belonged to a future that would never come to pass in this rewritten story. He cleared his throat. That is a possibility, but a betrothal might take time to arrange, and we face urgent threats. Tywin's forces may march on King's Landing at any moment. Renly nodded. Yes, time is of the essence. My own plan was to march on King's Landing while Joffrey squats there, but now that you hold it instead, things change. If we were to unite, your throne is safe from me, and I from you. Together, we could muster a host that dwarfs what Tywin can field. Tyrion, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. But Tywin is cunning. If he sees you unify, he might strike alliances of his own. The Westerlands remain wealthy, and the Stormlands are divided between Stannis and your side. The Ironborn might raid the coasts while the rest of the realm is distracted. And let's not forget that King Robb Stark in the north might have his own ambitions. Renly exchanged a look with Marjorie. Indeed, we cannot forget the North. If we gain your alliance, we might approach Robb, offer recognition of some limited independence or rights if he stands with us. It's better than letting him remain separate, or worse, side with Tywin. Jon inclined his head. I've already written to Robb, proposing a peaceful arrangement. He seems open to negotiation, especially now that Sansa is safe. The key question is whether the North truly wants to remain separate, or if they'll yield to a Targaryen. But at least they might yield to a Targaryen with Stark blood. Marjorie considered that, her eyes flicking to Sansa, who had thus far remained quiet. Lady Sansa, what do you think your brother in the North truly desires? She asked, voice warm. Peace or independence? Sansa swallowed, choosing her words carefully. She had been raised to be a diplomatic lady, though events in King's Landing had forced her to grow in ways she never expected. Robb only wants to protect the North from southern politics that have cost us dear. He never sought to be a king until my father was executed. The lords declared him king in the North to stand against Joffrey's injustice. Now that Jon has taken the throne from Joffrey, perhaps Robb will see the realm differently, especially if he knows Jon shares Stark blood. He might be willing to accept some form of unity, so long as the North is respected. Marjorie smiled. Spoken like a true Stark, honorable yet practical. The realm could use more voices like yours. Renly took a deep breath, setting his goblet aside. His expression grew more serious. We could debate these questions for hours. Perhaps we should speak more directly. You want me to acknowledge your claim to the Iron Throne? Yes. He looked at Jon. That would make me a rebel to Robert's memory, in many eyes. But I never quite believed Robert had the moral right to keep the throne. He won it through war, though Aerys was half-mad and Rhaegar's motivations remain clouded. Still, I might accept you if I see advantage in it. The question is, what do I gain? Jon did not hesitate. You gain the seat of Storm's End for your house, recognized in perpetuity. You gain a share in governing the realm, perhaps as my hand or as a leading advisor if you prefer. And you gain me as an ally to crush Tywin if he tries to impose Joffrey again. You gain the knowledge that you helped end the war quickly, sparing thousands of lives. Renly arched his brows. A generous offer, though you might consider that my own claim rests on Baratheon blood and the fact that Robert toppled House Targaryen. Some lords might question the wisdom of me endorsing the very line my brother slew. Also, there's the matter of Stannis. He will not yield to you, me, or anyone. If we fight him, he'll defend Dragonstone fiercely. Tyrion shrugged. Then we deal with him in time. If you and Jon present a united front, either Stannis yields or he wages a war he cannot win. He might see sense if we give him lands or titles to preserve his pride. Or perhaps we fight him if we must. Renly's gaze dropped to the table. I'd rather not see my brother undone entirely. He sighed. But this is war. We cannot let him sabotage the realm. What of the Tyrells? They risked their men and gold to support me. They'll demand recompense for shifting alliances. Marjorie flicked her gaze to Jon. We'll want guaranteed positions in the King's Council, perhaps favorable trade privileges for the Reach, acknowledgement of our preeminence among southern houses. And, if you're open to it, a marriage alliance. Not with me, obviously, she added with a light smile, but with one of our more prominent maidens. My cousin Eleanor is near your age, lovely, and well-spoken. Or another cousin if that suits your preference. It would seal the union in the eyes of the realm. Jon felt his spine stiffen, but he knew this was how politics worked, especially among the highest lords. A part of him bristled at the idea of wedding a stranger purely for advantage, but the realm's fate might hang on it. I'll consider that, he said. If we truly share a vision of peace, I'll do my part to make it lasting. Renly rose from his seat, pacing a few steps. This is a complex arrangement, but I see a path forward. I propose that we draw up a formal alliance. I, Renly Baratheon, will renounce my claim to the Iron Throne in favor of Jon Targaryen, acknowledging him as the rightful king by virtue of Rhaegar's blood. provided that House Baratheon of Storm's End remains secure in its holdings and status. House Tyrell and its bannermen will do the same, receiving the benefits Marjorie outlined. We will pool our forces to defend against Tywin Lannister or Stannis Baratheon, whichever strikes first, and we will invite Robb Stark to join us in a grand alliance that respects northern autonomy within the realm. Is that acceptable as the basis for negotiation? Jon caught Tyrion's eye, reading in it a certain relief. This was far more favorable than open warfare. Yes, Jon said, that is acceptable. We can craft the exact terms, but the broad strokes align with my goals. Unify the realm, prevent further bloodshed, and stand against those who insist on continuing the war. Marjorie's answering smile was bright, though faintly guarded. Randyll Tarly gave a curt nod, though he did not look entirely at ease. The other lords present murmured among themselves. Renly clapped his hands. Excellent. Let us put this alliance into writing with the signatures of all key lords present, and then we can host a small feast here by the Mander to celebrate. It won't compare to the halls of Highgarden, but it will do. So it was that Jon found himself engaged in near-endless discussion with Renly's advisors and Tyrell lords for the rest of that day and deep into the night. Tyrion aided in drafting the formal documents, employing his quick wit and knowledge of legal language. They hammered out the details, that Renly would keep the title of Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, that the Tyrells would remain Lords Paramount of the Reach, that certain trade privileges would be granted to the Reach for shipping goods to King's Landing, and that a marriage contract would be arranged between Jon and a suitable Tyrell cousin once the war was resolved. Jon insisted on a clause offering a chance for Robb Stark to negotiate a special status for the North, not full independence but significant autonomy, in hopes of averting conflict. Renly wanted a strong realm, but he was pragmatic enough to see that forcing the North into subjugation might only prolong the war. Marjorie supported the idea, seeing it as a symbolic act of generosity that could bolster Jon's reputation as a just king. It was midnight by the time the parchment was prepared, hammered out, and read aloud. By torchlight in the main pavilion, Jon signed the document, then Renly, then Marjorie, representing House Tyrell, followed by Tarly and several other notables as witnesses. Jon's stomach churned with a mix of relief and trepidation. The realm had known precious few times of peace in recent memory, and forging a brand new alliance felt simultaneously hopeful and fraught with risk. He could see the watchers' faces. Some looked genuinely optimistic, while others wore expressions of guarded calculation. They sealed the alliance with a small, improvised ceremony. Renly took Jon's hand and raised it, proclaiming that House Baratheon of Storm's End and House Targaryen were now united in cause, that the day of petty divisions was at an end. A polite applause rose from the men gathered, though not all sounded equally enthusiastic. Marjorie came forward, offering Jon a slender golden chain set with a single green gemstone, a gift from House Tyrell to the new king. Jon accepted it, uncertain how to respond. It felt foreign to be showered with honors. He slipped it over his head and felt the weight settle at his collar. Renly then poured wine into 2 silver cups, handing one to Jon. They drank a toast to the realm's unity, though both men knew the unity was still fragile. Tyrion, eyes gleaming with something akin to satisfaction, raised his own cup from the sidelines. Sansa lingered behind him, politely clapping, though she looked a bit overwhelmed by the swirl of politics. At last, the formalities concluded, and the assembled lords broke into smaller clusters, exchanging hushed remarks. The flicker of torchlight played across the walls of the pavilion, casting wavering shadows that made the entire gathering feel half dreamlike. Jon stepped back, letting Renly greet some of his bannermen, and found Sansa at his side. She looked up at him with wide eyes. "Jon," she said softly, "does this mean the war might be over soon?" He wished he could give her the answer she deserved. "Not yet," he said gently, "but it's a step in the right direction. Tywin won't yield easily, Stannis is still out there, and the Iron Islands might move at any time. But at least we now have allies." She exhaled, a slight quiver in her shoulders that spoke of hope and lingering fear all at once. "Allies," she repeated. "I just pray it's enough." Across the pavilion, Renly was in conversation with Randyll Tarly, who seemed uneasy. Jon's keen ears caught snatches of their talk, something about needing to maintain readiness for battle, how the Tarly forces couldn't be scattered if Tywin marched. Marjorie floated between clusters of lords, exuding calm graciousness, but Jon noticed her watchful gaze. She was quietly noting who seemed loyal, who seemed uncertain. A masterful performance, one that reminded him that this alliance hinged on more than just a signed parchment. That night, Jon found no real rest. He dozed in a small tent provided by Renly's stewards, Ghost curled at his feet, but the slightest noise made him jolt awake. Images of Tywin's army storming the gates of King's Landing plagued his mind. Would the city hold under Tyrion's defenses if Tywin attacked before Renly's forces could join them? And what of Stannis, who might see Jon's alliance with Renly as further proof of treachery against the Baratheon name? When dawn finally broke, Jon felt as though he'd hardly slept at all. Over the next few days, the new allies worked out logistics. Renly's current host was substantial, over 20,000 men from the Reach and Stormlands combined. Some were near Highgarden, others scattered across the Stormlands to keep Stannis' loyalists in check. Renly proposed gathering them all in a central location, then marching north to King's Landing in a grand display of force. Jon agreed, but insisted they do so swiftly, lest Tywin attempt a surprise assault or siege. A messenger arrived from King's Landing on the third day, carrying urgent letters. Tyrion read them first, then summoned Jon, Renly, and Marjorie into a private corner of the pavilion. "It's from Baelish and Varys," Tyrion explained, face drawn. "There are reports of a Lannister host moving east from Harrenhal, perhaps 10,000 strong, led by Ser Gregor Clegane under the banner of the Lion. They're raiding the Riverlands, but also rumored to be marching toward the Blackwater. Tywin himself may move separately with another force. The City Watch remain loyal, but they can't repel a large-scale attack alone. If Tywin invests the city from multiple directions, it will be difficult to break the siege unless you and Renly move quickly." Renly scowled, face darkening. "I expected Tywin to be bold, but not so soon." He turned to Jon. "We must act faster. I'll rally my men at Bitterbridge, as many as can gather in a fortnight, and then we march for the capital." Jon nodded, ignoring the knot of apprehension in his belly. "Agreed. I'll ride ahead to the city with a small escort to reassure the people. If Tywin thinks to cow them into submission, let him see that I stand ready to defend my throne. Once your host is assembled, follow with all speed." Renly paused, thoughtful. "Or we could remain together to present a united front. If you ride alone, you risk being intercepted. Tywin's outriders could ambush you." Tyrion cleared his throat. "A valid concern, but the city may need your leadership sooner rather than later, Jon. Baelish and Varys can coordinate, but it's not the same as having the king on hand. If you travel lightly and quickly, you might slip past Tywin's scouts. Or you could take a longer route." Marjorie touched her husband's arm. "He's right, dear. Jon's presence in the city would do much to bolster morale. I suggest letting him go with a swift contingent while we gather the armies. The realm needs to see that the crown is not absent." Renly hesitated, then inclined his head. "So be it. We can't tarry. I'll do my best to have at least half the host marching within a week. The rest will follow swiftly." Jon breathed a little easier. "I'll leave Sansa in your care," he said quietly. "I don't want to risk her safety if we're traveling light. Once we secure the city, she can return to me, or perhaps go north to see our mother." Sansa, who had overheard, looked uncertain but nodded slowly. "If you think that's best. It's safer," Jon said gently. "You'll be among allies here with a large force to protect you. If I'm racing back to the city and trying to dodge Lannister outriders, the road could be dangerous." She pressed her lips together. "As you say." With that decided, Tyrion offered to ride with Jon. "I'm not exactly a warrior, but my mind might prove useful if we need to get past Lannister lines." They spent the rest of the day making preparations. Jon entrusted Sansa to Marjorie's personal retinue, ensuring that she had women of the court for company. He left instructions for some of his knights to remain as well, to watch over her. Then, near dusk, Jon, Tyrion, Ghost, and a small band of a dozen picked riders departed the Mander camp at a swift canter, heading north and slightly east, hoping to skirt the main roads. They aimed to return to King's Landing within 4 or 5 days if they pushed hard. The journey was tense from the start. They avoided major towns, resting at hidden groves or small villages rumored to be free of Lannister influence. At one such village, they heard rumors of mountain men, raiding farmsteads to the west, presumably Gregor Clegane's outriders. Tyrion, who had once traveled with such men in the Vale, let out a grim laugh at the irony that he was now fleeing from men even more vicious than them. They pressed on, riding at dawn and halting only at nightfall, each time posting guards to watch for any sign of Lannister scouts. Once or twice, they spotted smoke on the horizon, as if a hamlet had been torched. They gave such areas a wide berth, lacking the numbers to confront a substantial force of raiders. Jon's jaw clenched each time he saw ravaged fields or burned barns. The realm was indeed bleeding, with Tywin's men sowing fear wherever they roamed. On the third evening, they reached a cluster of rolling hills near the Windwater, from which they could cut east to approach King's Landing from the southern side. They made camp in a hollow between 2 hills, building a small, smokeless fire to avoid detection. Tyrion dozed under a tree, while Jon kept watch, Ghost at his side. Memories of the old days in Winterfell flickered through Jon's mind, but those days felt like a distant dream. Dawn was only an hour away, and already the sky showed faint traces of gray at the eastern edge. Suddenly, Ghost lifted his head, ears pricking. A soft growl rumbled in his chest. Jon tensed, scanning the darkness. He thought he heard the snap of a twig on the far side of the camp. Silently, he reached over and prodded Tyrion with his foot. Tyrion jerked awake, eyes widening at the clear signal that something was amiss. They waited, breath tight. Jon heard the dull clink of armor, and his heart pounded. If it was a small group, they might fight or flee. If a large Lannister party had found them, it would be dire. He pressed a hand to Ghost, calming the wolf so he wouldn't leap prematurely. Out of the shadows came figures in dark cloaks. 4, perhaps 5, emerging from behind the hill. Jon's men, roused by the noise, scrambled to their feet. Steel flashed in the faint starlight. The intruders must have realized they were spotted, for one of them hissed, "We mean no harm if you stay your blades." Tyrion, unarmed for the moment, called out, "Who goes there?" A tense pause, then the intruders stepped closer. The man in front pulled back his hood, revealing a gaunt face with deep-set eyes. "Harren's men," he said. "We're from the Riverlands. We saw your fire." Jon frowned, not lowering his guard. Harren's men? Harren is a name from old legends. House Harren the Black? That can't be right. The man looked wary. "We've no love for Lannisters, if that's what concerns you. We're refugees, not raiders. Our village was burned by Gregor Clegane." Behind him, another figure let out a choked sob, a woman from the sound of it. Jon peered closer. Indeed, he saw that the intruders included a woman holding a small child, a second man who could barely stand from a leg wound, and 2 older children crouched behind them. They looked half-starved. Their clothes were ragged, and the smell of sweat and desperation clung to them. Ghost, sensing no immediate threat, ceased growling, though he remained watchful. Jon exhaled, lowering Longclaw an inch. "You're fleeing the Lannister raiders?" The man nodded miserably. "They took everything, crops, livestock, even the larder. Those who resisted were butchered. We tried to hide in the hills, but we can't go on much longer." Jon glanced around at his men. Most had awakened fully and stood with swords half-drawn, trying to parse the situation. "You took a risk approaching our camp. Could have been Lannisters." The man swallowed. "We had no choice. My children are starving. If you have any food, or if you can point us somewhere safe." Tyrion muttered something under his breath, eyes flicking to Jon for guidance. Jon recognized the look. "We can't help everyone, we're barely a small party ourselves." But Jon's resolve hardened. "Give them some rations," he instructed quietly. "We can't leave them to starve." A few of Jon's men grumbled, But Tyrion, surprisingly, spoke in favor. Yes, a gesture of goodwill might be wise. They pose no threat, and word might spread that the new king does not abandon the small folk. Jon nodded. Exactly. We'll share what we can. But we can't remain here long. They gave the refugees some bread, dried meat, and a few skins of water. The woman wept openly in gratitude, and the children devoured the scraps as if it were a feast. The man called Heron tried to kneel in thanks, but Jon told him that was unnecessary. We're heading for King's Landing, Jon said softly. If you can make it south of the city, the roads might be safer soon. Renly Baratheon is gathering an army to drive out the Lannisters. The refugees nodded, though they still wore the hollow expressions of people who'd lost everything. Before departing, the man gripped Jon's hand, so tight that Jon felt the tremor in his bones. Thank you, he whispered. We thought all kings were cruel. Perhaps we were wrong. They vanished into the darkness, and Jon was left with a swirl of emotions. Anger at the devastation inflicted by raiders, sorrow for the realm's innocent, a faint flicker of pride that he might be able to set things right. Tyrion said nothing, but his eyes were thoughtful in the gloom. As dawn broke, they extinguished the last embers of their fire and readied the horses to ride, an uneasy tension gripping them all. They pressed onward. The next few days passed in a blur of tired horses and constant vigilance. On the morning of the 5th day since leaving Renly's camp, they spotted the distant silhouette of King's Landing. The city's walls and towers gleamed in the early light, a sight that should have been a relief but instead filled Jon with apprehension. Smoke hovered above the horizon. Not thick black smoke of an ongoing siege, but enough to suggest there had been recent trouble. They approached from the south, following the Rose Road's final stretch as it curved around to the city gates. Jon had donned a plainer cloak to avoid drawing immediate attention, but as they neared, the gold cloaks on the walls recognized Tyrion at least. The gates creaked open, and they were admitted with minimal delay. Inside, Jon could see the tension in the faces of the city watch. Many looked nervous, sweat beading on their brows. They saluted, bowing as they realized who Jon was, though not all seemed equally enthusiastic. What's happened? Jon asked the first watch officer he could find. The officer stammered, My lord, your grace. A small Lannister force tested our outer defenses near the mud gate 2 days past. Nothing major, but enough to spook the small folk. They burned a few fishing huts. Word is Tywin might march in full soon. Lord Baelish and Lord Varys have done what they can to keep order, but folks are frightened. Jon shared a grim look with Tyrion. Where are Baelish and Varys now? At the Red Keep, your grace. They've been organizing repairs to the walls, stockpiling provisions for possible siege. Some Riverlands knights arrived 2 days ago, seeking your banner. They're waiting for you as well. Jon wasted no time. He and his small escort rode at a brisk trot through the winding streets. The city smelled as it always did, a mix of waste, sweat, and faint spices from the markets. But there was an added undercurrent of fear. People peered from doorways or shutters, uncertain if the men riding past were friend or foe. Some recognized Jon from the day he departed and cried out timid greetings, but most simply watched. Tyrion scanned the crowds with practiced wariness. Ghost loped alongside Jon's horse, causing startled gasps wherever the direwolf passed. Upon reaching the Red Keep's gates, they saw extra guards posted. One recognized Jon at once and signaled for the gates to swing open. They clattered into the courtyard, where a swarm of activity greeted them. Pages running errands, soldiers loading crates of arrows, and the clang of blacksmiths at the forges. Baelish stood near the center, directing a group of workers with animated gestures, his mockingbird pin catching the sun. When he turned and saw Jon, his eyes lit with relief. Your grace, Baelish said smoothly, stepping forward and bowing. We feared you might have run afoul of Lannister patrols. Welcome back. Jon dismounted, rubbing the stiffness from his shoulders. We traveled carefully. I've reached an alliance with Renly Baratheon and House Tyrell. They'll gather an army and march here to help defend the city against Tywin. That alone should shift the odds in our favor. Baelish's lips curved, half smiling. Indeed? That is excellent news. The small folk will find comfort, I'm sure. Tywin's men have been raiding near the Blackwater, but no full siege yet. Lord Varys is inside, dealing with the last of the cargo shipments we procured. The plan is to fortify ourselves for at least a month, if it comes to that. Tyrion swung down from his mount, pressing a hand to his lower back. Any sign of Stannis? None, Baelish said. He remains at Dragonstone, presumably mustering ships, but I suspect it'll be some time before he moves. For now, the immediate threat is Tywin. Jon handed off the reins to a stable hand. What of Joffrey and Cersei? Baelish's smile thinned. Secure in their chambers. Joffrey rages daily, threatens all manner of violence, but he's under constant guard. I gather you intend a formal trial eventually. Jon nodded. Yes, but only after we repel Tywin or force him to negotiate. Understood. One more note, Your Grace. A small group of Riverland's knights arrived, led by a man named Ser Perwyn Frey. He claims to speak for House Frey, though I'd caution you to trust Walder Frey only so far. Ser Perwyn at least seems well. He claims to want to fight the Lannisters in your name. They're waiting in the Great Hall, hoping for an audience. Jon blinked. The phrase. He remembered the letter from Walder Frey offering sly alliances. All right, I'll see him, but first, I want to confer with Varys about the city's defenses. Then I'll meet these knights. Baelish inclined his head. At your leisure, Your Grace. He gestured to a page. Show the king's party to their rooms so they can wash and rest. We'll convene in an hour. Jon felt a mixture of fatigue and urgency. He nodded, turning to Tyrion. Let's get cleaned up. Then we plan for war. They followed the page into the Red Keep's interior, passing corridors bustling with busy courtiers and servants. The sense of tension was palpable, as if the keep itself braced for a storm. Shadows played on the walls, elongated by flickering torchlight. Jon's boots echoed on the stone. Ghost padded behind, silent as ever, but occasionally huffing at the unfamiliar scents. Tyrion parted ways to find his own chamber, while Jon was shown to the one he had stayed in before, near the royal apartments. It felt strangely comforting to see the same tapestries, the same carved bed, after the harrowing journey. He removed his dusty cloak and armor, washing his face in a basin of water that a servant had hastily provided. The cool water felt like a blessing on his travel-worn skin. He could almost forget for a moment that the city might soon be besieged by Tywin's armies, that the realm was still fractured. Almost, when he changed into a clean tunic of dark gray, he ran a brush through his hair, then secured it out of his face. Ghost watched, ears perked, as if expecting they would be moving again soon. A quiet knock came at the door. Jon opened it to find Varys, dressed in voluminous silks of pale lavender, hands folded. Your Grace, the spymaster said in his soft voice. Welcome back. I hear you've returned with encouraging news. Jon stepped aside, letting Varys enter. Yes, Renly and the Tyrells will march to support my claim. With that many men, Tywin might think twice about attacking. But I suspect he'll try something cunning. Varys's expression was unreadable. Lord Tywin is not one to yield easily, but with the Tyrells arrayed against him, his odds dwindle. Unless, well, there are always unforeseen factors. Jon narrowed his eyes. Meaning what? Varys inclined his head. Stannis for one, or the Ironborn for another. And rumor has it your half-brother, pardon, your cousin, Robb Stark is still uncertain whether to remain king in the north or join you. Tywin could attempt to sow discord, or perhaps strike an agreement with some among the Tyrell bannermen to betray you. We live in precarious times, Your Grace. Still, this alliance is our strongest shield so far. Jon exhaled. I'll have to meet with the Riverlands Knights, see what they offer. Maybe we can gather more support. In the meantime, how prepared is the city to withstand a siege? Varys laced his fingers. We have stockpiled grain from the Reach, arranged by Lord Baelish. The city watch numbers have been reinforced. We have crossbows, spears, even a few scorpions placed along the walls, though not nearly as many as we might wish. King Aerys's caches of wildfire remain, should you choose to use them, though I caution you, they are dangerous in the extreme." Jon grimaced, recalling old tales of how Aerys nearly burned the city with wildfire. "Let's keep that as an absolute last resort. No sense repeating the Mad King's madness. If Tywin's men do come, we'll rely on conventional defenses until Renly arrives to break the siege." Varys nodded approvingly. "A prudent choice. I am relieved your head is not full of Targaryen fire and blood. The city may yet be spared." They spoke a while longer about the rumored movements of Gregor Clegane's outriders and the possibility that Tywin's main army might be gathering near Harrenhal or the Gold Road. Varys had spies everywhere, but Tywin was adept at hiding his true intentions. Nonetheless, the presence of the Tyrell host somewhere behind King's Landing might well deter him from launching a direct assault. Perhaps Tywin would wait or attempt to broker an alternative approach. So long as Joffrey remained a prisoner, Tywin's impetus to storm the city was strong, but also dangerous for him. He risked losing everything if he failed. Jon clung to that hope. When their talk concluded, Varys bowed himself out, leaving Jon to gather his thoughts. Ghost lay near the door, blinking lazily. Jon ran a hand along the wolf's flank, thinking how in the north, the biggest worry might be a harsh winter or wildling raiders. Now here, entire armies threatened. Deciding he had rested enough, Jon left the room, calling for a guard to guide him to the great hall where Ser Perwyn Frey and his companions waited. A swirl of nerves threaded through his belly. The Freys were notoriously untrustworthy, but in times of war, every sword could matter. He prayed he would not regret meeting with them. He crossed the keep's corridors, descending a wide flight of stone steps into the great hall. Gold cloaks flanked the main doors, opening them at his approach. Inside, the high-vaulted ceiling echoed with the shuffle of feet and the low hum of conversation. At the far end stood the Iron Throne, a menacing silhouette of fused swords. Jon avoided looking at it too long. He remembered all too well the night he first claimed it. Instead, he focused on the small group of men waiting near the foot of the dais. Ser Perwyn Frey was a young man with a surprisingly honest face for a Frey, hair cropped short, wearing a tabard displaying the twin towers of his house. He bowed as Jon approached, though he did so with a hint of nerves. Behind him stood half a dozen knights and men-at-arms, all wearing Frey colors. Jon noticed one older man with gray whiskers and a hard, calculating stare, doubtless an advisor to keep Perwyn on a tight leash. "Your Grace," Ser Perwyn said, voice carefully polite. "I am Perwyn Frey, third son of Lord Walder Frey. We've come to pledge support against the Lannisters who burned our kin in the Riverlands. My father regrets he cannot come in person, but he has many responsibilities at the Twins." Jon nodded, sizing the man up. "I've heard Lord Walder's position is flexible. Why does he send knights to me now?" Perwyn cleared his throat, glancing at his older companion. "Walder Frey is not blind to the changing winds. King Robb Stark once had my father's fealty, but that alliance is complicated." He hesitated, seeming uncertain how much to reveal. In truth, the old man is unhappy that Robb spurned a Frey marriage arrangement, but that is a matter for the North. Meanwhile, the Lannisters menace our lands, and you have taken King's Landing from Joffrey. My father thought it wise to offer you a gesture of support, if you will consider awarding certain privileges to House Frey once this war is done. Jon bit back a sigh. The usual Frey approach, support for a price. What privileges? The older Frey stepped forward. "We desire official recognition as paramount keepers of the crossing at the Twins. A toll on all shipments traveling north-south, enforced by royal decree. Also, we request a seat on the small council for one of Walder Frey's grandsons. Or perhaps a betrothal arrangement linking House Frey to the Targaryen line." The older man's voice was calm, though a hint of greed glimmered in his eyes. Jon frowned. "That is quite a list of demands for a small band of knights. I appreciate the willingness to join our cause, but I will not promise an entire seat on the council or burdensome tolls on the realm simply to appease your Lord Father's ambitions. Is that understood?" Perwyn seemed to blanch. "Your Grace, we merely convey Lord Walder's requests. Perhaps we can negotiate more modest concessions." Jon looked from Perwyn to the older man, who gazed back impassively. "I cannot bargain away the realm's best interests. However, if House Frey fights bravely against the Lannisters and helps secure peace, I will remember it, and I might reward them accordingly. But these demands must be tempered." The older man's lips thinned. "We understand, Your Grace. We only wish to ensure House Frey's loyalty is valued." Jon nodded stiffly. "Value is earned, not demanded. Let's see how your men fare. If you wish to remain in the city and aid in its defense, you are welcome. Or if you wish to ride out and harass Lannister forces in the Riverlands, that too would help. What does Lord Walder prefer?" Perwyn glanced at the older man, then back to Jon. "We'll remain here for now, if that pleases you. We can help fortify the walls, drill with the gold cloaks, and stand ready if Tywin tries to seize the gates. House Frey wants to be on the winning side, and it seems that is yours." Jon suppressed a wry grin at the frankness. "Very well. Report to the Master-at-Arms to coordinate your efforts." He turned his gaze on the older man. "If I learn that you're sowing discord or working with Tywin behind our backs, I'll have no mercy to spare. Do I make myself clear?" The older Frey inclined his head. "Perfectly, Your Grace." With that, Jon motioned for a steward to guide them away. Perwyn actually seemed sincere enough, or at least willing to do his part. The older man was harder to read, but Jon knew better than to trust a Frey wholeheartedly. Still, every sword might count when the city was threatened by the Lannisters. He breathed out, letting the tension ease from his shoulders. Another petty negotiation, another piece on the board. So it went. He wondered how Ned had managed all the burdens of lordship in Winterfell for so many years without bitterness. Then again, Ned Stark had not had to worry about 5 claimants to the throne and an impending siege of the capital. The rest of the day passed in a blur of administrative tasks. Jon met with Baelish to discuss finances. There was enough gold for a few months' pay to the City Watch, but after that, they would need new sources of revenue or a loan from the Iron Bank of Bravos. Jon also reviewed the state of the walls with the castle engineers, who assured him they were making repairs where needed. Tyrion had resumed his role as an unofficial quartermaster, checking the stockpiles of grain and allocating resources. Meanwhile, Varys quietly directed spies to keep track of Tywin's movements. By the time evening fell, Jon was thoroughly exhausted. He returned to his chambers, removing his tunic and boots, then slumped onto the bed. Ghost settled at his feet with a soft huff. Jon stared at the ceiling, letting the hush of the night seep into him. The faint city noise drifted through the window, the occasional bark of a dog, a distant clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Even in a city bracing for war, life went on. His thoughts turned to Sansa, who remained with Renly and Marjorie. He hoped she was safe, perhaps finding some measure of peace in Marjorie's refined company. He thought of Arya still missing. A pang of guilt gnawed at him. He had not found her, and she could be anywhere. Lost, captured, or perhaps dead. But he refused to accept that. Then there was Robb in the north, likely hearing rumors of Jon's alliance with Renly. Would he join them or insist on northern independence? He was drifting in that swirl of half-formed worries when a firm knock sounded at the door. Groaning, he swung his legs off the bed and walked to the door, braced for more urgent news. He opened it to find Tyrion, who held a half-empty wineskin and wore a wry expression. "Apologies if you were resting, Your Grace," Tyrion said, "but I thought you might like an update. Also, I brought wine." Jon stepped aside, letting Tyrion in. "As if you read my mind. I could use a cup." They settled around a small table, Tyrion pouring the deep red liquid into 2 cups. Ghost eyed them from his spot on the floor, but apparently found the conversation uninteresting, returning to a light doze. Jon lifted the cup and sipped. The wine was surprisingly smooth, likely from the arbor. He allowed the warmth to soothe his nerves, though he remained wary of overindulgence. Tyrion took a longer drink before speaking. Our scouts report that Tywin remains near Renly, but Gregor Clegane is indeed ravaging the riverlands. So far, the main roads east to King's Landing remain under watch, but no massed assault has begun. Word of your alliance with Renly might have reached him, giving him pause. Jon nodded. Good. If he hesitates too long, Renly will be at our gates with a large army, and Tywin's chance to besiege the city vanishes. He might have to fall back. Tyrion peered into his cup thoughtfully. And if that happens, he might retreat to the Westerlands and fortify, which would be better for us in the short term at least. Jon set his cup down. It would. We could call a council, invite Tywin to negotiate. Maybe we can end this without more bloodshed. Tyrion's lips twisted in a sardonic half-smile. You're an idealist, Jon. Tywin rarely negotiates unless he holds all the cards. Right now, you hold Joffrey, which is a rather large card indeed. I suspect he'll keep testing the waters, waiting for you to slip. Unless, of course, you do something that forces his hand. Jon tensed at that. Such as executing Joffrey, Tyrion said quietly, or publicly declaring your betrothal to a Tyrell cousin, or forging an alliance with Robb that corners the Lannisters from multiple directions. Any one of those might provoke Tywin into a rash gamble. Jon closed his eyes briefly. I won't execute Joffrey without a trial, and I'm not betrothed yet. As for Robb, I do plan to reach out again. Maybe he'll see that the war could end if we unite. He's my family, after all, no matter the truth of my parentage. Tyrion sipped more wine, silent for a long moment. Then he said, I admire your loyalty, both to the Starks and to your newfound heritage. But loyalty can be a dangerous thing. I learned that the hard way with my own kin. Jon studied the dwarf's face, the lines of weariness etched into it. Thank you for standing with me, he said quietly. I know it cost you something to turn on your father and sister. Tyrion shrugged. I turned on Joffrey, which is hardly a moral quandary. As for my father, he never much valued me. So it's not as though I lost his warmth and affection. His attempt at jest sounded hollow. Then he stood and drained the last of his cup. I'll leave you to your rest. Tomorrow's another day of preparing for a war that may or may not come. Sleep well, your grace. Jon accompanied him to the door, nodded a farewell, and then sank onto the bed once more. He stared at the flickering light of a lone candle. Through the cracked window, the hush of the city was broken by distant voices, faint and unrecognizable. Ghost twitched in his sleep, paws moving as if he ran in a dream. Jon could almost imagine being a wolf himself, running free in the forests of the north rather than tangled in a web of politics. But a king did not have the luxury to flee his burdens, and so he closed his eyes, willing himself to rest. The next week played out in a tense waiting game. Letters came from Renly indicating that he was gathering men at Bitterbridge and would march soon. Scouts reported skirmishes in the Riverlands, but no large Lannister host approaching. Tywin's caution suggested he was trying to gauge the strength of the new alliance. Baelish, ever opportunistic, hinted that some Lannister bannermen might be swayed to Jon's side if offered enough gold or titles. But Jon refused to stoop to brazen bribery. They needed genuine stability, not a realm stitched together by purchased loyalties. Still, he knew Baelish might quietly attempt it anyway. One afternoon, news arrived that Cersei had demanded once again to speak with Jon. Hoping to glean insight into Tywin's plans, Jon agreed. He met her in a small solar guarded by 2 gold cloaks. Cersei wore a subdued gown of gray, her golden hair bound in a tight braid. She stood at a window, hands clasped behind her, a faint line of tension on her brow. When Jon entered, she turned, the movement revealing a flicker of frustration in her eyes. So, she said without preamble, you've formed an alliance with Renly. Do you truly think the Tyrells will remain loyal to you once the dust settles? Jon crossed his arms. They have reason to back me over Joffrey. The realm disliked your son's rule, and the Tyrells see a chance to restore order under a Targaryen king. Cersei let out a humorless laugh. Order under a Targaryen? If Robert were alive, he'd laugh himself sick at the irony. You may have the Tyrell swords for now, but don't think for a moment they won't discard you if it suits them. The same goes for Renly. Jon studied her, noting the faint shadows under her eyes. You asked to speak with me. Is it NLY to cast doubt? She squared her shoulders. I asked to see if you might consider a different path. Tywin would negotiate if you release Joffrey and restore Cersei Lannister to the seat of the Queen Mother. He might even accept you as a Lord Paramount somewhere, if you yield the throne. Jon shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. You know I won't. Your son killed my father, and I hold the rightful claim. Why would I give up now? Her mouth tightened. Because you're a fool if you think the Tyrells or Renly will keep you on that throne once they taste power. My father is cunning, but so is Margaery Tyrell. Do you truly wish to trade one manipulator for another? Release Joffrey, join forces with my father, drive out the Baratheons. You might even keep Sansa safe. Isn't that what you want? Jon felt anger flare. You dare speak of Sansa? You know how your son abused her. He forced himself to calm, voice quiet. This conversation is pointless, Cersei. Joffrey will stand trial. If Tywin wants to negotiate, he can come forward with better terms than yield the throne or die. She pressed her lips together, a flicker of desperation in her gaze. You're sentencing my boy to death. Whatever his sins, he's still a child. Jon felt a pang of conscience. Joffrey was indeed young, but the cruelty he displayed was monstrous. That depends on the outcome of the trial. But he must answer for Ned Stark's death and countless other crimes. The realm deserves justice. Cersei's jaw clenched. Justice, a pretty word used by men to justify whatever suits them. She turned away, staring out the window again. Then I have nothing more to say. You won't free him, and you won't accept my father's terms. Fine, I tried. Go on playing at being king. But know that Tywin will not rest until his grandson is freed or avenged. Jon took a measured breath, stepping back toward the door. Then we stand at an impasse. I'll let you return to your chambers. I won't keep you any longer. She did not turn, her shoulders stiff with barely contained fury. The guards opened the door for Jon, and he left, the tension thrumming in his veins. That had been a futile conversation, but it confirmed what he already knew. Tywin wanted Joffrey back at all costs. War seemed inevitable unless Renly arrived with such force that Tywin dared not strike. Days trickled by in a haze of preparation and vigilance. Jon took time to address the city's small folk, riding through some of the streets with a small escort, hearing their pleas for cheaper bread or for relief from the Gold Cloak's heavy hand. He promised to do what he could, though he had limited resources. He ordered the new masters of coin and distribution to ease price gouging, awarding small subsidies for staple foods. The city remained uneasy, but some commoners appreciated that he was at least trying to help rather than ignoring them as Joffrey had done. At last, word came that Renly's vanguard was nearing the city. A column of riders appeared on the horizon one bright morning, streaming the banners of the Golden Stag and the Rose. Jon and a party of knights rode out to meet them at the King's Gate. Renly himself was at the head, clad in gleaming armor of gold and green. Margaery was not with him. She remained in Highgarden, apparently to manage the home front. But a significant portion of Tyrell and Stormland's knights accompanied him, thousands more trailing behind in the baggage train. The sight of so many well-equipped soldiers set the city into a cautious sort of jubilation. Here at last was an army that might stand against Tywin's threat. Renly entered the city amid cheers and curious stares from the small folk. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man beloved by his retainers. Jon welcomed him at the gate, exchanging a firm clasp of forearms. Renly's troops marched in good order, flooding King's Landing streets with color and clamor. Many pitched their tents outside the walls, near the fields east of the city, though a few were quartered within. The city's population nearly doubled overnight, causing a spike in prices and crowding, but the morale soared. With so many swords guarding the walls, a direct assault by Tywin looked far less likely. That evening, Jon and Renly held a joint feast in the Red Keep's Great Hall, not as extravagant as the old days. Supplies had to be conserved in case of siege, but enough to mark the formal union of their forces. Platters of roast duck, spiced carrots, fresh bread from the city's ovens, and a limited amount of wine were served. The hall was crowded with knights, captains, and a smattering of courtiers. Tyrion circulated, listening to gossip and sowing bits of disinformation to confuse any potential Lannister spies. Varys lingered at the edges, ever watchful. Jon sat at the head table beside Renly. They shared polite conversation, occasionally leaning in to discuss urgent matters in hushed tones. Renly inquired if there was any sign of Tywin's approach. Jon replied that scouts had not reported a mass movement yet. They spoke of Stannis as well, concluding that an envoy might be sent to Dragonstone to propose a settlement, though neither expected much success. Late in the feast, a messenger arrived in haste, pale-faced and breathless, seeking the king. The herald led him through the throng to Jon. The man fell to one knee, panting, and managed to gasp out that riders had come from the north, bearing a banner with a direwolf. Jon's heart soared, half hoping it was Robb himself. But the messenger continued. It was small party, not an army, waiting outside the gates. Among them was a familiar face, Catelyn Stark. Jon leapt to his feet, face alive with excitement and apprehension. Renly watched with interest, letting Jon step away from the table. The hall buzzed with speculation as Jon hurried out, Tyrion and a few knights in tow. They descended the steps of the Red Keep and made their way to the courtyard by torchlight. There, by the flickering glow of lampposts, stood a handful of cloaked riders. The banners were indeed grey direwolves on a field of white House Stark. In their midst was Catelyn, draped in a heavy cloak, her red hair streaked with more silver than Jon remembered. She held the reins of her horse with a steady hand, though her posture hinted at fatigue. When she saw Jon approach, she started forward, her eyes brimming. Jon felt a jumble of emotions: relief, worry, guilt, gratitude. He bowed his head. "Lady Stark," he murmured. She set her jaw, gazing at him with an unreadable mix of feelings. "Jon," she said quietly, stepping closer. A moment stretched. Then her expression softened, and she laid a hand on his cheek. "My apologies if this is not how a subject greets a king, but it's been a long road." He swallowed, remembering how aloof she had always been to him in Winterfell. Perhaps grief had changed her. He gently rested his hand over hers. "I'm glad you're here," he said, voice thick. "I didn't know if you and Robb would ever. That is, She shook her head. "We have much to discuss. May we speak privately?" Jon nodded, turning to Tyrion. "Find them quarters. See to their horses." He then gestured for Catelyn to walk with him into the keep, where they could find a quieter space. The other Stark riders followed at a respectful distance. He led her to a lesser hall with a small hearth, the corridors mostly empty as the feast continued elsewhere. Ghost padded behind them, causing one of Catelyn's men to stiffen nervously, but she waved him off. They settled near the hearth, letting the warmth chase away the evening chill. Catelyn took a deep breath, then turned to Jon, studying him as though seeing him anew. "It's true, then. You hold King's Landing, and you've proclaimed yourself a Targaryen." Jon inclined his head. "Yes, I discovered the truth of my parentage, that Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark were my mother and father. Ned hid me to protect me from Robert's wrath." She closed her eyes briefly, pain flickering across her features. "So that's why, oh Ned, he kept that secret from everyone, even me, to spare you. I wish he had told me sooner. Perhaps I would have treated you differently." Jon felt a lump in his throat. He'd long yearned for acceptance from Catelyn. "It doesn't matter now," he said softly. "We can't change the past." She nodded, eyes wet. "I came because Robb sent me to treat with you on behalf of the North. Word reached us that you had saved Sansa, dethroned Joffrey, and allied with Renly. Robb was uncertain how to respond, but he knew I might speak with you more freely." She paused, studying his face. "Have you any word of Arya?" Jon's heart sank. "No, we've searched. Varys's little birds have scoured the city, but no sign of her. She might have escaped to the Riverlands or perhaps further. I wish I had better news." She looked stricken, but squared her shoulders. "Then we keep searching. Now about the north. Robb remains king in the north by declaration of his lords. He says he'll consider supporting your claim if you grant the north its freedom from southern entanglements, at least in some measure. He does not want to rejoin the realm as it was, not after Ned's death and the broken trust. But he's open to a compromise, as you suggested in your letters." Jon rubbed his temples. He'd anticipated this conversation. "I want peace, Lady Stark. If I must grant the North a unique status, I will. But the realm needs unity to face the threats of Tywin, Stannis, the Ironborn, and beyond. Renly and I have an alliance. The Tyrells are with us. I want Robb's alliance too. He can remain king in the North in name, but let us be allied kings, united in defense. No more bloodshed between us." She regarded him thoughtfully. "2 kings. That's unconventional, but perhaps it's workable. Robb wants no more southern wars. If you vow not to interfere in the North's governance, and he likewise respects your domain in the south, then an alliance could stand. We'd fight the Lannisters together, if they threaten the Riverlands or the Neck." Jon let out a breath. It sounded complicated, but maybe it could work. "I can agree to that. The details might need refining, but if it ends the fighting between Stark forces and the Crown, I'm willing." She pressed her lips together. "Robb also wants Sansa returned safely north, and assurance that Arya will be welcomed if found. That goes without saying, but I'm to bring his words." Jon nodded. "Sansa is currently with Renly's queen, Marjorie, but she'll return soon. She's free to go where she pleases. Her home is in the north if she wishes." Catelyn's expression softened at that. "Thank you." Silence stretched a moment, the hearth crackling. "It's strange. You, a Targaryen, sitting in the Red Keep, forging alliances with Baratheons and Tyrells. Ned would be proud of the good you've done, I think, yet sorrowed at the cost. He wanted peace for the realm." Jon felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. "I know. Everything I do, I try to honor his memory. Even if the blood in my veins is Targaryen, I learned my honor from him." She reached out, hesitating, then laid a hand on his arm. "We'll face what comes. For now I'll rest. In the morning we can draft a formal treaty for Robb. Then I'll send a raven to him with our proposals. If he accepts, you'll have the North as your ally." Jon placed his hand over hers gently. "Thank you, Lady Stark." She inclined her head, withdrawing her hand. The flicker of distant grief lingered in her eyes, but she forced a small smile. "I suppose I should call you Your Grace, but to me you are still the boy who lived under Ned's roof. Perhaps that will never change." Jon dipped his head, unable to find the right words. He gestured for one of his guards to show her to a prepared chamber, instructing that she be given whatever comforts she required. As she departed, accompanied by her knights, Jon felt a surge of cautious hope. If the North joined, Tywin's position weakened further. Maybe they really could end this war. The next day, Jon and Catelyn worked with Tyrion to draft the terms. Renly's men were informed that a separate treaty would be drawn if the North recognized an alliance. The broad outlines were, Robb would retain the title king in the North would have autonomy in its internal affairs, but in matters of realm-wide concern, the North would stand with the Targaryen crown. The North would not pay certain taxes to the Iron Throne but would provide mutual defense. Sansa and Arya's safety was guaranteed, and any current conflicts between Stark and Targaryen forces were to cease. Jon insisted on a clause that if the White Walkers or any threat beyond the Wall proved real, the entire realm must unite. Catelyn looked skeptical but agreed to include it. She penned a letter to Robb, explaining the terms and urging him to accept. Jon affixed his seal. They sent it north with a swift messenger under the Stark banner. Catelyn would remain in King's Landing until an answer arrived, or until events forced her to move. With that done, Jon found a rare moment to breathe, though the atmosphere remained charged. Renly's soldiers patrolled the streets. The gold cloaks maintained order at the gates, and rumors swirled that Tywin was preparing a diplomatic overture or perhaps a cunning assault. But no direct move came in those first few days after the alliance had solidified. Finally, a raven arrived from the west. The letter bore Tywin's seal. Jon summoned Renly, Tyrion, and Varys to the council chamber to read it. They gathered around a heavy table lit by tall candles. Jon broke the wax and unrolled the parchment. Tywin's words were curt and unyielding. He demanded Joffrey's release and the restoration of House Lannister's honor. He acknowledged that a large host stood with Jon, but threatened that if Joffrey was executed or harmed, he would ensure that House Targaryen's second fall would be even more devastating than the first. He offered one avenue for peace, a marriage arrangement between Myrcella Lannister and Jon, thereby uniting Targaryen and Lannister claims and effectively whitewashing Joffrey's crimes. But Joffrey would still be set free, recognized as a prince, and the city would yield to Tywin's oversight. Renly read the letter again, sneering at Tywin's arrogance. Tyrion frowned, picking at the edges of the parchment. He offers you a Lannister bride in exchange for letting Joffrey off scot-free and ceding real power to Tywin. Essentially, you become his figurehead. Jon slammed the letter onto the table. Impossible. Joffrey must face justice. This is no compromise. It's a demand that we surrender everything. Renly nodded. We can't accept. Not after all that's happened. Varys's voice was calm. Then we must expect that Tywin will try something else. Maybe an assault, maybe a subterfuge. He might try to turn one of your allies, or he might attempt to break your lines in the field. Jon met their eyes. Then we prepare for war. If Tywin wants to avoid bloodshed, he needs to offer better terms. Otherwise, we stand ready. Renly's host is here. The city is fortified. The North may soon join us. Let Tywin come and see if he can break us. No one voiced disagreement, and so they waited. In the days that followed, scouts reported increased Lannister activity around the Gold Road, but no major force marching on King's Landing yet. Gregor's raids in the Riverlands continued, but the Riverlords, freed from fear of Joffrey, began to fight back. Rumor had it that Robb Stark had begun shifting some of his troops southward, though no confirmation had reached Jon. The tension rose to a fever pitch, as if the entire realm balanced on a knife's edge. Then, at dawn on a crisp autumn day, a rider galloped to the city's gates, shouting that the Lannister army was advancing. Trumpets were heard in the distance. Smoke rose from the fields on the western horizon. King's Landing braced for its greatest test. Jon and Renly rallied their forces. The gold cloaks manned the walls. The Tyrell foot and archers assembled outside the gates alongside hundreds of knights. War horns sounded across the city, echoing over rooftops. The small folk scrambled for shelter, bolting doors and shuttering windows. The looming shape of the Red Keep dominated the skyline, a final bastion if the enemy broke through. From the western road, dust clouds billowed. Banners of red and gold flapped in the strengthening wind. Thousands of Lannister spearmen, swordsmen, and cavalry moved in disciplined ranks. At their head, an imposing figure in gilded armor rode a massive warhorse. Even at a distance, Jon knew it must be Tywin Lannister. He carried himself with the imperious bearing of a lion on the prowl. Jon's heart hammered. He stood atop the city walls, Ghost at his side, scanning the horizon. Renly waited below with the main host, mounted on a stallion. His banner of the Golden Stag and Tyrell rose flying. Tyrion was on the walls as well, overseeing the placement of archers and scorpions. Baelish had taken a vantage point in a tower, presumably ready to watch the outcome. Catelyn stood near the gate with a handful of Stark men, prepared to see whether the North might arrive in time or if they would stand alone. The Lannister army halted out of longbow range. A small group of riders emerged, waving a white banner of parley. Jon saw Tywin among them, accompanied by a pair of mounted knights. They advanced cautiously. Renly's retinue rode forward to meet them at the halfway point between the city walls and the Lannister lines, also bearing a white banner. Jon decided it would be better to meet Tywin personally than wait behind the walls. He descended the stairs quickly, instructing Tyrion to remain in command of the defenses until he returned. "If I'm taken hostage or killed," Jon said grimly, "you know what to do." Tyrion gave a tight nod. Renly was already cantering out to meet Tywin, wearing a proud expression. Jon spurred his horse forward, Ghost loping behind him. Some watchmen gasped, seeing the direwolf run free, but no one stopped him. A hush fell over the battlefield as the two parties approached each other. The wind rustled the tall grass, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Tywin reined in a few yards away, eyeing Jon with cold, calculating green eyes. He looked older than the stories suggested, lines etched in his face, but the aura of command was undeniable. A thick cloak embroidered with gold lions draped his shoulders. At his side rode Ser Kevan Lannister, stoic and silent, and one more unnamed knight, visor down. Renly spoke first. "Lord Tywin, you come to parley? Or do you come to demand again?" Tywin's gaze flicked to Renly, then back to Jon. "I come to see if your so-called king is wise enough to avoid a slaughter." He nodded at Jon. "Boy, you hold my grandson. Release him and we can discuss terms. If you refuse, I have nothing to say." Jon forced himself to remain calm. "Your grandson stands accused of regicide and murder. He'll face trial. If you want to avoid a slaughter, yield. Accept that the throne is no longer yours to control." A muscle in Tywin's jaw twitched. "Your throne rests on a child's rumor. No official record confirms your parentage, aside from half-forged documents. Rhaegar is dead, and Elaya's children died in the sack of King's Landing. You are an upstart bastard playing at power. I will not yield the realm to such a farce." Jon clenched his fists on the reins. Ghost let out a low growl from behind him, but Jon kept the wolf at bay with a quiet gesture. "My father was Rhaegar Targaryen, and my mother was Lyanna Stark. The realm supports me. Renly Baratheon stands wit. Me, the Tyrells stand with me. The North is close to an accord, and the people of King's Landing prefer me to your brutal grandson. You are outnumbered, Tywin. Don't throw your men into a hopeless fight." Tywin glared at Renly. "Robert's youngest brother, siding with Targaryens again? Have you no respect for your own blood? Your other brother, Stannis, remains unyielding on Dragonstone. He would name you a traitor." Renly's face hardened. "I do not need your lectures, Lannister. The realm suffered enough under Joffrey. Jon Targaryen is a better king than that vicious boy could ever be." Tywin cast his gaze over the city walls, the archers bristling, the massed ranks of soldiers behind Renly. His expression was grim, but unbowed. "So be it. I had hoped to avoid mass bloodshed, but you leave me no choice. You are all traitors to the rightful line of succession as established by Robert Baratheon and recognized by the great houses. I will see you pay for your insolence." Jon's temper flared. "You talk of rightful lines, yet Joffrey is no Baratheon at all. You can't hide that secret. The realm knows." Tywin's eyes narrowed. "Empty rumors. Enough. I will give you one last chance. Release Joffrey, renounce your claim, and you and your allies may keep your heads. Refuse, and we will see who truly outnumbers whom once I call in my banners. The Westerlands remain mighty, and not all the Riverlands support you. The Ironborn might join us if they sense weakness in your lines. You think you stand on firm ground, but war is unpredictable, boy." Renly's horse pawed the ground, sensing the tension. "Make your choice, Lannister. We've heard enough threats." Tywin turned his horse with a sharp tug on the reins. "You'll hear my answer at sunrise, when I present my army for battle. May the gods have mercy on your souls." With that, he spurred his mount, and his entourage wheeled around, galloping back toward the Lannister lines. Jon exchanged a look with Renly. "He wants to fight." Renly nodded, eyes steeled. "We hold the advantage of position. The city walls plus my host. Let him come. We'll break his lines or force him to retreat." They rode back toward King's Landing, hearts pounding. The watchers on the walls murmured anxiously, reading the grim set of Jon's jaw. The entire city braced for what dawn might bring. A fierce battle or a last-minute retreat? No one could say. Jon halted his horse at the gate, scanning the horizon one more time. Tywin's banners were already pulling back to their lines. The sun dipped behind them, casting the battlefield in orange and gold. In the hush before war, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jon guided his horse into the city, Ghost trotting at his side. Soldiers parted to let them pass, gazing at their king with a mixture of resolve and fear. Renly rode to rejoin his commanders, giving quick orders to prepare for a dawn engagement. Meanwhile, Jon dismounted and climbed the steps to the Red Keep. Tyrion met him in the courtyard. "So?" the dwarf asked, face pale with tension. Jon let out a shaky breath. "He wants to fight. At sunrise." Tyrion cursed softly. "Then we'd best be ready." That night, torches burned on the walls, watchmen standing vigilant. Soldiers slept in their armor, weapons within arm's reach. The city's bells fell silent, as if the very sound might break the taut hush. In the Red Keep, the mood was somber. Jon gathered with Renly, Tyrion, Varys, Baelish, and other commanders in a final war council. They outlined the defense, placing archers on the ramparts, cavalry in the fields outside the gates, infantry behind them. Renly would command the cavalry charge if needed, while Jon oversaw the overall battle from the walls. Tyrion would coordinate fire support with scorpions and catapults. Baelish said little, though he listened intently, eyes flickering with calculation. When the council ended, Jon stepped out onto a balcony overlooking the silent city. The lights of countless torches glimmered below. Beyond, the plain where tomorrow's battle would rage lay in darkness, except for the distant glow of Lannister campfires on the horizon. Ghost pressed against Jon's leg, as if sensing his unease. Jon placed a hand on the wolf's head, drawing a measure of calm from the beast's steady presence. He remembered all that had led him here. Ned's death, the discovery of his heritage, the overthrow of Joffrey, the alliance with Renly. And now, in a single day's fight, it could all be undone, or Tywin might be repelled, ushering in a new era. Either outcome felt precarious. Jon's thoughts drifted to the people who counted on him. Sansa, wherever she was with Marjorie, Catelyn, who had put aside old resentments for the realm's good, the small folk craving peace. He closed his eyes, sending a silent prayer to the old gods and the seven both, though he wasn't sure which might listen. At last, weariness overcame him. He returned to his chambers and sank onto the bed, not bothering to remove his clothes. Ghost curled up at his feet. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by visions of blazing swords, roars of battle, and the screech of dragons that didn't exist in this world. Before dawn, horns blared. Jon jolted awake. The hour had come. He donned his armor, plain but well-forged steel, with a black cloak pinned by the dragon wolf sigil. He secured Longclaw at his hip. Ghost, ears alert, stuck close as Jon hurried to the courtyard. There, a swirl of activity greeted him. Knights mounting horses, archers gripping bows, pikemen forming ranks. Renly was already astride his destrier, clad in shining plate with the golden stag on his breastplate. Jon caught a glimpse of Catelyn among the men, wearing a mail shirt over her gown. She wouldn't fight, but she refused to hide, it seemed. He offered her a nod of respect. She bowed her head in return, as if silently wishing him well. Tyrion hurried over. "The Lannister lines are advancing, Your Grace. We estimate at least 10,000. We have 15,000 here, plus the city walls. Odds favor us, but Tywin might have tricks up his sleeve." "Let's meet him," Jon said, mounting his horse. Ghost leapt up, ready to follow on foot. A standard-bearer lifted Jon's newly forged banner. The Targaryen dragon combined with a direwolf outline, a subtle homage to his mixed heritage. Another carried Renly's stag. The gates creaked open, and the cavalry poured out, the thunder of hooves shaking the earth. Infantry followed. On the walls, archers took position, scanning the field in the gray light. The battlefield stretched wide. Mists clung to the low ground, obscuring distant shapes. As the sun's first rays broke over the horizon, the outline of Lannister banners came into view. A sea of red and gold, moving steadily forward. Trumpets blasted from both sides, the clarion call of war. Jon's heart hammered. He led a small group of cavalry near the front, feeling the rush of adrenaline. Renly was to his right, face set in grim determination. The infantry lines bristled with spears behind them. The plan was to hold the line until the Lannisters came within range of the archers on the walls. Then the cavalry would flank or charge, depending on Tywin's maneuvers. The Lannister front rank marched closer. Jon squinted, trying to spot Tywin himself. He might be somewhere behind, orchestrating from a vantage point. The whoosh of arrows soared overhead, the city archers firing their first volley, arcing down upon the Lannister ranks with deadly hiss. Shouts rose, men falling. The Lannisters quickened their pace, horns bellowing in furious response. And then the lines crashed. The Lannister front surged forward, colliding with the Tyrell and Stormland's infantry in a clamoring tangle of swords and shields. The roar of battle swelled, a hideous cacophony of steel on steel, screams of the wounded, and bellowed commands. Jon spotted pockets of chaos as men fought at close quarters, the sunrise glinting off blood-spattered armor. Renly shouted, "Now, King Jon!" and raised his sword high. Together, they led a wedge of cavalry to slam into the Lannister flank. Ghost bounded ahead, teeth bared, weaving between horses to lunge at unsuspecting foes. Jon's adrenaline surged as he drove Longclaw down on a Lannister spearman. The man collapsed with a cry, blood spraying. Another soldier tried to thrust a pike at Jon's horse, but the beast sidestepped, and Jon parried the blow with practiced ease. Chaos reigned. War cries echoed in every direction. Arrows continued raining from the walls. Some found their mark. Others missed or struck friend and foe alike in the tangled melee. Jon fought to keep track of Renly, glimpsing his green-plumed helm bobbing in the press. The cavalry wedge punched a hole in the Lannister line, scattering men left and right. Shouts of Targaryen and "For the King" mingled with the Lannister war cry of "Hear me roar." The swirl of battle made it impossible to see the entire field. Jon could only trust that Tyrion and the archers continued to do their part. At one point, he saw a group of Lannister knights ride in from the far flank, smashing into some of Renly's men. He wheeled around, spurring his horse to intercept. A knight in gilded armor rushed him, lance lowered. Jon angled Longclaw upward, chopping at the lance's tip. With splintered, the knight nearly unhorsed. Ghost lunged at the knight's steed, causing it to rear. The knight toppled, and Jon's sword found an unarmored gap at the man's neck. Panting, Jon pressed on. The sun climbed higher, revealing the grim scope of the battlefield. Bodies littered the trampled ground, blood seeping into the dirt. War horns blared anew from the city walls, signaling a push. Renly's cavalry, reorganized, made another charge at the Lannister center. This time, Jon saw the lion banner begin to waver. Some Lannister ranks broke, fleeing or stumbling backward. The city's archers poured arrows into their ranks, thinning them mercilessly. Yet the Lannisters did not yield outright. A stubborn core of disciplined troops remained, possibly under Kevan Lannister's direct command. Jon heard cheers from his own men as the Lannister left flank collapsed, but the center still fought fiercely. Across the field, a swirl of dust showed more Lannister reinforcements arriving. If Tywin was truly there, he might be preparing a counterstroke. Renly rode up beside Jon, visor lifted, face streaked with sweat and grime. "We're pushing them back, but not enough. They might regroup. If we can find Tywin and strike a decisive blow, they could crumble." Jon nodded, scanning the chaos. "We need to end this. Too many are dying." He spurred his horse forward, rallying the cavalry for a final push. The thunder of hooves shook the ground as they galloped across the churned earth, Ghost bounding ahead. Renly flanked Jon, standard-bearers close behind. They tore into the heart of the Lannister lines. Steel clashed, men screamed, horses shrieked. Jon felt the sting of a glancing spear on his thigh, pain flaring, but he fought on, hacking at an armored foe. A swirl of golden hair flashed by, another Lannister knight, who nearly unhorsed Renly with a powerful swing. Renly recovered, driving his sword through the knight's breastplate with a grunt of effort. Then, through the swirl of dust and blood, Jon glimpsed a figure in gilded plate, red cloak swirling, a commander shouting orders. It was Tywin Lannister, reining his mount amidst a ring of knights. Jon saw the older man's face twisted in anger, barking commands for a last stand. Jon felt a surge of determination. If Tywin fell, the Lannister host might collapse entirely. He spurred his horse, charging at the cluster of knights around Tywin. Ghost darted ahead, but was blocked by a mounted knight with a lion-engraved shield. The knight and Ghost circled each other, the wolf snarling. Jon engaged another knight, deflecting a blow to his shield, returning with a slashing arc that cut across the man's helm. Blood spattered. The knight toppled. Tywin's eyes locked with Jon's for an instant. The old lion recognized him. He raised his sword, beckoning for Jon to come closer, a grim challenge in his glare. Jon urged his horse forward. But at that moment, a swirl of Lannister swordsmen closed in from the side, forcing Jon to defend himself. Tywin turned to slash at one of Renly's cavalry, toppling the man from the saddle. The chaos was too great for a clean duel. Nearby, Ser Balman Mertens, one of Jon's knights, tried to intercept Tywin's flank but was struck down by a Lannister spear. Renly hacked his way closer, shouting for Tywin to yield, but Tywin sneered in response, his ring of knights fighting ferociously. For a moment, it seemed Tywin might be overwhelmed. But then a horn blared from behind the Lannister lines, and more lion banners surged forward, rallying to Tywin's position. Renly cursed, adjusting his helm. They still have reserves. This could drag on. But the tide of battle across the field told a different story. The Lannister left and right were nearly shattered, men fleeing in droves. Only the center near Tywin stood firm. Jon realized that if he and Renly pressed the advantage, Tywin might be encircled. Already, the city's archers had repositioned along the wall to fire at the Lannister center from the flank. The Lannisters were fighting with their backs against a sea of arrows. Jon shouted, "Push on them! Surround them!" He spurred his horse again, ignoring the sting in his thigh. Renly roared agreement, raising his stag banner high. The allied cavalry surged, while infantry advanced steadily, reforming ranks around the battered Lannisters. The ring of Tywin's protectors grew tighter as men fell to arrow or blade. Suddenly, Tywin's horse shrieked, struck by an arrow in the neck. It reared, nearly throwing him. Tywin kept his seat with remarkable skill, but it cost him precious seconds. Another arrow whizzed past, striking the horse in the flank. The beast buckled, toppling sideways. Tywin leapt free at the last instant, landing hard on the churned ground. He rolled to avoid being crushed, then struggled upright, sword still in hand. He found himself on foot, ringed by foes, his knights frantically trying to form a shield around him. Jon saw his chance. He dismounted, rushing forward with Ghost. Renly also dismounted, leaving others to guard their horses. The swirl of battle parted momentarily, revealing Tywin with half a dozen knights at his side. They tried to fend off the allied soldiers, who circled warily. Ghost darted in, snapping at a knight's ankles, forcing him to step back. Jon leveled Longclaw. "Yield, Tywin. This battle is lost. Spare your men further bloodshed." Tywin's face was streaked with sweat and dirt, his eyes burning with defiance. He glanced around, seeing the collapsed Lannister lines, the retreating or slaughtered men. Only a few pockets fought on, soon to be crushed by overwhelming numbers. His shield-bearers bled from multiple wounds. In the distance, the city walls bristled with archers, a final deterrent if they tried to flee. The old lion's breath came ragged. Slowly, he turned his gaze back to Jon. Then, with a snarl, Tywin lunged, swinging his sword at Jon. Their blades collided in a burst of sparks. Jon staggered under the force. Tywin was strong, even if older. Ghost sprang forward, but a Lannister knight blocked the wolf, receiving a savage bite to his arm. Tywin hammered at Jon's guard again. Jon deflected, the shock jarring his arms, but he stood firm. Renly moved in from the side, forcing Tywin to twist away. Another allied soldier stabbed at Tywin's flank, but Tywin parried with ruthless skill, wounding the man in the shoulder. Blood spattered the ground. Jon pressed forward, each blow aimed to disarm or subdue. Tywin retreated a step, panting. His knights were all but overwhelmed, cut down or pinned by superior numbers. The ring closed tighter. "Yield!" Jon shouted again, heart thumping. He had no desire to butcher Tywin, but he would if forced. Tywin's eyes blazed. "Never!" he spat, brandishing his sword for one final strike. But before he could bring it down, Renly lunged from behind, hooking his blade under Tywin's guard. Tywin whirled too late. Renly's sword sliced deep into the side of Tywin's armor, biting flesh. Tywin gasped, staggered, and dropped to a knee. His sword fell from numb fingers, blood seeping between the plates of his armor. A hush spread around them, the ring of swords quieting. Tywin Lannister, the feared lord of Casterly Rock, knelt in the churned mud, face twisted in shock. Jon stepped forward, long claw at the ready, uncertain if the old lion would try one last move. But Tywin was finished. He sank further, grimacing in pain. Renly withdrew his blade, breath heaving. "He's done," he said. Jon stepped beside Tywin, raising Longclaw's point to the man's throat. "Yield," he said softly. "I'll not ask again." Tywin's eyes flickered with hatred. Then, faintly, he breathed, "I yield." A wave of relief and dread washed over Jon. The roar of victory from the allied soldiers rang out across the battlefield, mingled with the dying moans of the wounded. It was done. Tywin Lannister was captured. The Lannister army was broken. The field belonged to Jon Targaryen and Renly Baratheon. Jon ordered men to bind Tywin's wounds and secure him as a prisoner. The remaining Lannister soldiers, leaderless, soon threw down their arms or fled. Some were pursued, but Jon commanded restraint. Enough blood had been spilled. The battered survivors were rounded up. After ensuring the city walls were safe, Jon limped among the wounded, offering what comfort he could. Ghost padded at his side, muzzle bloodied but calm. By midday, the smoke of the battlefield drifted in tatters, the crows already circling. The stench of death lay heavy on the wind. But the realm's greatest threat, Tywin, lay in chains. With him undone, Joffrey's cause collapsed. Lannister loyalists would have little reason to keep fighting. A path to peace, or at least an uneasy armistice, lay open. Jon stood on a slight rise outside the city walls, gazing upon the carnage. Renly joined him, removing his helm to wipe sweat from his brow. "It's over," Renly said, subdued. Jon nodded. "We won. But at what cost?" Renly's eyes scanned the field. "All wars cost too much. But maybe we saved the city from a bloody siege. Perhaps the realm can breathe again." Jon exhaled. A swirl of emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Sorrow for the fallen, relief for the living, the weight of decisions yet to come. What to do with Tywin? What of Joffrey's trial? Would Stannis still march? And how would the North respond when the war they declared was now effectively over? He steeled himself, letting the autumn wind whip his hair. For now, the day was won. Tomorrow, the realm's future awaited. With Tywin's defeat, perhaps the Seven Kingdoms truly had a chance to heal. And for the first time since he took the throne, Jon felt a glimmer of hope that his reign might indeed bring the peace he had so desperately sought. He turned away from the battlefield, returning to the city that called him king, determined to forge a more just realm from the ashes of war, and to ensure that the sacrifices made this day would not be in vain.